Hello everybody, I am Simon Henke and this is a step-by-step guide to build a UXP plugin for Adobe Photoshop. Now this is more of a beginner's guide, but if you have some experience in CAP development and want to switch over to UXP, this might also be a nice starting point. So I think it's mostly, or it's easier to learn with real scenarios. So I thought of this issue I faced multiple times in Photoshop already, where I wanted to scale multiple layers at once, but keep them all at their respective position, which is unfortunately not possible. I think this becomes clearer if I show this in Photoshop. So if you select two layers here and want to scale them, they will always share one anchor point here. And we are going to build a plugin which looks like this and can scale two layers in their own position. Like that. Let's undo this. Okay, so what are we going to learn? We will learn how to set up a plugin using the developer tool, and we will interact with Photoshop to scale the layers. After this, we will include some spectrum components to build our user interface, and we'll also use the debugging feature of the developer tool to find issues or bugs in our code. And whenever you have user input, you always want to validate it and also notify the user based on his inputs if it's correct or not. After this, we will persist the data that the user inputs so that he doesn't have to write it every time. And lastly, we will use batch play, which is, if you are familiar with CAP development, the newer technology for or kind of replacing Action Manager code, if you know that one, and lets you do things that you cannot do with the Photoshop API. Okay, before we get started, here are two more links. The first one to the GitHub repository, where you can find the finished code for the plugin. And if you want to read up things about the Photoshop API, you can check out the documentation here. All right, let's get started. So first of all, you will open up the developer tool here to create your plugin, and you can click create plugin here, and this will open up the dialog where you can first of all enter plugin name. Let's call this multiscale. Some ID, the same one. Plugin version, you can also take the default values here. Which host application you want to support, just copy those values, and then you can select a starter template here. We stick to the PS starter one. Then you select your folder. And it's been created successfully. So let's open this up in our editor of choice. I'm using Visual Studio Code here. So on the left here, you see the project structure, which is pretty straightforward. You have some folder for the icons. You have your HTML file where you write the interface, your JavaScript for writing the logic, and some other files. One more important thing is the manifest JSON. This is where all the details about your plugin is listed. For example, your ID and name that you gave before, and also you can specify the plugin, the preferred size for your plugin interface panel. So now if you want to open up your plugin in Photoshop, you can use the dev tool here to load the plugin. And as you can see, there's already some pre-built panel here in the starter kit. You can use this for once. If you click the button here, you see it's already connected to some logic and will list up all the layers we have. But since this is not what we are going to build, we will tidy up the code a bit here. Let's move to the index file. And first of all, we can get rid of some styles here. Also delete this body tag here, the SP body tag. Let's call this scale layers. Also name the button like that and give it an ID. Say button scale. And if we go over to the index.js, you see there's already a bit code here. We can delete that one too, except for the first line, which I'll explain later. And the button here was already connected, so we also have to rename it here to the name we gave it, or to the ID. And we can also rename the function to scale layers, which is what we want to do. Okay. Now, if you want to see the changes here, you will have to open up the dev tool again and reload the plugin. But what you can also do is watch the plugin, which will check for any changes in your source files and then reload the plugin automatically, which is quite handy. So let's try this out. If we write something here, you will see that it gets updated immediately. Okay, so now we have tidied up the project here and are ready to build our own plugin. So the first thing we want to do is interact with Photoshop itself to scale the layers. Here are some tips that you can check out. We want to loop the selected layers and select them one by one and then use some function called layer.scale. So let's try this out. Now, whenever you want to communicate with the host application, you will have to require this Photoshop module here, and .app is the current instance of the application. So in order to get the selected layers, you can write active layers equals app.activeDocument.active layers, which is an array. Now, if you want to know how to get all these, or how to find this structure of all the objects, you can check out the documentation here for the Photoshop API, and you can read about Photoshop, the application, document class, layer class, and so on. And you see that there's an active document which has active layers and so on. So now that we have our active layers, what we want to do is loop over them. So we can do this with a for loop, or for example a for each loop, which I like a bit more. For each, and we can open up the block for every single layer here. Now what we want to do is scale them. So as you saw on the slides, there's this function called scale, which takes a percent value, and one for the width and one for the height. So we scale them both by or to 50%. All right. So now let's see what happens. Now, if we click the button, we see that they get way too small, but they're already scaled. But we also see that exactly the problem that we didn't want to have did occur, because they scale to the center point here. But we see at least that the scale function is working. So what is happening here? Now, As you can see, we have both layers selected, and what Photoshop does is it iterates, or what the plugin does is it iterates over each selected layer and scales, or calls the scale function. But since we have both of them selected at once, it will just scale them one time and another time. So as written on the slide, we have to select them one by one. Now, for this we need some kind of workaround. If you have implemented something similar in CAP, you know that you can simply set the active layer. But for UXP, this is not yet implemented that well, meaning that we cannot set this value, only read it. And there's a property called selected on each layer. Also, one more tip: if you want to see this exact structure again for all the objects, you can either check the documentation, or you can also open up this debug window here. And if you go to the console tab here and copy paste this code, then you can type here and see the actual values, for example, app.active document, and you also get suggestions here. Layers, which is an array, select the first one, for example, the name, and it will print out this name of the first layer here. Okay, so I wanted to show this so that you can see that there's a selected property which we can set, and this way of checking the properties is quite reliable if the documentation on the website is not always up to date. Okay, so what we have to do here is iterate those layers once again before we run our scale code. And for each layer, we want to set selected to false to deselect it. And inside our main for each loop here, where we scale the layer, we will set this specific layer to selected. And when we are done, we will set it back to false. All right. Let's see if that worked. Now, as you can see, they both scaled to 50% and kept their initial position, which is what we wanted. And one more tip. Now, if I'm building plugins, I always try to keep the selected state of all layers the same as before I called any function or did anything in the plugin, so that the user can maybe scale one time, scale another time, and doesn't have to select them again. So one third loop here. The code is looking a bit verbose, but it does what we want. So we select them when we are finished. Try this. Okay, as you can see, they are still selected, and we could run our script again. Nice. Okay, so the next step is adding some input elements to have the user specify or set the size that he wants to scale the layers by or to. And for this, I'm using Spectrum components. And Spectrum is a design system provided by Adobe, which helps you to build more consistent user interfaces. And you can use those Spectrum components right away without any imports. So if we switch over to the index.html, we can now add SP text field and give it an ID. Size input, give it a value, a start value, 100, and let's make it a number input. If we save, we can already see it here. And it's also good practice to add a label to every input so that the user knows what the value is about. So for this, we'll use a SP label tag here. And in order for it to render, you have to assign a slot called label to it. Let's see. I always like to include the unit also. So we write % here, and you can see it over here. Okay, now we've added this to the panel, but it's not connected yet. So let's move this up here a bit. You might be familiar with interacting with the HTML DOM, or you can just copy this one here. If you write document get element by ID, we can get the input here. We call it size input. And what we want to do is in our function here, and say the size is equal to the value of our size input, which is the way to read values from an input element. And now we'll replace the size in our scale function. Now I'm expecting this to not work, and I will explain later why. If we now run this function, enter some value here, you see that Photoshop did something. It was selecting those layers as we've written our code, but it didn't scale them. So you could now look for any bugs and maybe console log, but let me show you a nicer way to find some mistakes, which is actually debugging our plugin. So in the debug window, you can go to sources. I'll make this a bit bigger. And you can set breakpoints here. For example, let's set a breakpoint to this line 17 here, where we use the size variable. So now if we click the button, we see that it's catched here in the breakpoint. And if we open up this closure here, we can check out the current values. And we see that size is 50, but it's not a number here. It's a string value, a text value. And the scale function expects a number value, a numeric value. So what we have to do, and by the way, that's the standard way that HTML input elements return a value. This is usually a string value. So we can cast this to number using this call here. And if we try it again, don't forget to remove your breakpoint. Okay, this worked. We can also try some different values, maybe 80%, which worked also. Nice. Okay, let's move to the next chapter, which is validating the user input and also showing them an alert based on their input. So we can use app.showAlert for this. And here are some tips: that the size shouldn't be 100% because we can't scale anything, or it wouldn't have any effect if we scale it to 100%. And also we want to have at least one selected layer. To do this, we can just write a simple if statement, if condition here, if the size equals 100, we will show this alert, app.showAlert, different like this. And don't forget to return so that the following code is not executed. You could also like write an else statement here and so on, but return works fine too. And at the start here, we want to check if our active layers dot length equals 0. Please select at least one layer. Okay, let's try if this works. If we deselect all layers here and run our code, it will tell us to select at least one. Oh no, it's telling us to select a value different than 100% and also to select one layer. Now, I forgot what I mentioned before. I have to return, of course. Okay, now it tells us to select a layer. If we select a layer and have the size here at 100%, it will show an alert too. Okay, this was an easy step, so let's move on. Now we want to persist the plugin state, or the user input in this case, to the local storage, or you could also use some save it to some file in your Explorer. But the local storage is a nice and easy way to get this done. And we will also need some event listener, because we want to save our input whenever we type anything in this box. So why do we even want to do this? Now, if we enter some value here and save our plugin, it will always reset to the default value that we set here. So let's add some event listener. We will listen to the change event here, and on every change we will open up this anonymous function here, and now we can write our input value to the local storage by saying local storage dot set item. This local storage is a storage with some key value pairs, so you can specify a key, for example size, and the next value is what you want to save in there. So we want to save size input dot value, and of course we do not only want to write the value, we also want to read it on every plugin start. So we will set the value of this input to local storage get item, and now we can use the same key we set before to read out the value. But keep in mind that the first time we run this plugin, or at least before we change the value here, nothing is inside of the local storage. So we will have to use an OR operator here to set it to its current value again if nothing is in here. So if this is undefined, it will take the current value. Okay, now you might be wondering why we can simply use this local storage object here. And this is because it's part of the global scope or of the window scope. So we could also write window.local storage, but we can also leave it away. Same would apply here. Could also leave that away. And let's try this. Now, as you can see, I might have had some value from before already, but if we now enter this one, save our plugin, it will not jump back to 100, but will keep the current value that we set here. All right. Now the final step is using batch play, which is a bit more advanced, but it can help us overcome some limitations of the Photoshop API. And now what we want to do is convert those layers we're scaling to smart objects. So why do we want to do this? I think it's a good practice to do whenever you're scaling layers. So unless you're having some shape layers, which are vector graphics, you will have some pixelation or blurriness once you scale a layer down and scale it up to the original again. You will see it's quite pixelated here. So we will try to convert it to a smart object, which saves the original size and will keep the layer crisp and clear. Now, on the slide here, you will see how to use batch play. And this is the more modern way, or the replacement of the Action Manager code from CEP development, which was quite hard to read and not really nice to use with all those action descriptor and action reference classes and so on. And with UXP, this all has become a bit more readable and modern. And you can, or it's using, under the hood, it's using simply JavaScript objects, which are more easy to read. So the descriptor for this is something like this. Let's call this toSmartObject. And those action descriptors are, as said, just JavaScript objects, and mostly, or I think always, have this obj key. And for this specific event, it's called, I think, new placed layer. What was it called? Yeah, new placed layer. And of course, you don't just have to randomly guess it or anything like that, but you could, in theory, search for event listener here, or event, attaching event listeners, and it will tell you can, during development, you can use app.eventNotifier to listen to all events. And you could do this, then do some event in Photoshop, check out this this descriptor or this event name here to write your descriptors for batch play. But a more convenient way is using the Alchemist plugin by Jada, which provides a nice user interface where you can just listen here for events in Photoshop. And we can then do something like convert it to smart object, and you will see it recorded a bunch of things here. And the last one is new placed layer. This is where you can find those event names, and it can also generate some code for you to insert in your plugin. Okay, so now that we have the descriptor here, what we want to do, we move this to the bottom. What we want to do is convert our layer to a smart object with batch play. So first of all, let's tidy up with this a bit here. I will move this call to the top if we might reuse it. And we also need just the Photoshop module. Photoshop is required Photoshop, and our app is photoshop.app. All right. And now we have to use the action module or namespace. So for each layer, we'll say photoshop.action.batchplay. And this function takes an array of these action descriptors here, those. So we enter this one here. And secondly, it will always need some options object or settings for this batch play call. Even if you don't want to specify anything, you still have to include those empty brackets here. Now, you have to remember batch play is always or usually asynchronous, because it might take some time for Photoshop to process those events. And if we want to execute our code in the order that we write it in, we will have to excuse me, we'll have to await this call here and also make our function async. Or the alternative for this would be to use those options here to add synchronous execution true, and this should wait for it to finish internally. Okay, let's see if that one worked. I think it should still break. Okay, let's try. Yes, as expected, you can see that the first one got converted to a smart object, which is nice since we now can see that our batch break call was working fine, but it didn't scale anything, and it also didn't convert the second layer. So we can suspect that at this point here, something is breaking. The first one did work, and this line here didn't execute. So what is actually going on? Now, it's helpful to have some knowledge of how Photoshop works internally, or at least using the interface here also. And if you have used smart objects before, you noticed that once you convert it, it will create a new layer here, and your original content is nested inside of this smart object here. Now, if you open this up, you can see our original layer inside. And the problem with that is that we are trying to scale our layer reference here, but this layer is no longer the one that we had before. It's now nested inside of the smart object, and we cannot target this one. And in order to fix this, we are going to set this to the currently active layer app.active.document.active_layers, the first one, because when we select it and convert it, we can be sure that it is still the selected one. And like this, we can update our layer reference here. Now, what we also want to do is update the layer reference inside this active layers array that we are looping to have this up to date too. Now, in order to do this, we can adjust this list of parameters here. So in a for each loop, you don't only get this layer object, but you also can get the index of your current element. And you can now set it back to the updated reference. So active layers at this specific index equals our updated layer reference. Okay, let's see if this is working. Select both layers and try to scale them. Okay, it scaled them correctly in their own position, and also made a smart object out of each of them. And one more thing to notice is that we would currently do this every time we use our plugin to scale the layers, and eventually we would end up with some kind of those Russian nesting dolls where you have one smart object or one doll inside another doll and so on, and it becomes a mess and isn't really what the user would expect. So we want to make sure that we only convert it to a smart object if it's not already one. And for this, let's use the trick we had before, where we can use our console to check out actual values here. So if we take the first selected layer here, we can print out a property called kind, which is the layer type. And I'm doing this because this kind is just represented as a numeric value here, a number. So you have no, if you have no clue what those numbers are about, you can use this to print it out. You see a pixel layer is the kind type of number 1. For example, this adjustment layer would be 11, and we can now check that a smart object equals to 5, which is what we need. So only if our layer.kind is not equal to 5, we want to convert it to a smart object, which was this code here. Oops. And now we are done. We can validate this by running our script multiple times. So let's say 75%. Created a smart object. Let's do this again. Check inside. There's still only our original layer and not another smart object here. Okay, nice. We have created our first plugin successfully, and it's working fine and can actually help us in our Photoshop workflows because it's doing things that were normally not possible. And I've created 2 more tasks here, or ideas for the plugin to refine it. And I can show you, maybe I can show you this directly in Photoshop. Now the first idea was to have one input for the width and one for the height, so that you can scale this independently. Let's undo this here, which would look like this, for example. And you could also add this checkbox here to lock the ratio and then synchronize values between those 2 inputs. So if I type here, you will see that both of them get updated. And the second idea is creating a plugin where you can list or where you can set specific layers that you want to synchronize transformations between, so that you don't have to select both layers, but you can just work on one layer and your transformations will get synchronized to the other one. So if I set this here, you will see we now connected ellipse 1 and ellipse 2. And what this does is we can even not only scale uniformly or just do normal scale, but we can also do some complex transformations here. And the other layer will copy this exactly. The code for this is a bit more complex, but for both of these tasks, you can go to the GitHub repository and check the source code or the finished source code for the solution. Or you could also try this out by yourself, of course. And essentially what the second thing is doing, it's listening to the transform event. And when you listen to those events, you can get the descriptor, this action descriptor, which you can reuse in a batch play call. So I saved this one, and then just change the target for the batch play. So I record the transform descriptor from this object, set the target to the other layer, and then repeat the same descriptor here, which will result in copying the same transformations. All right. Now, thank you very much for watching. I hope that you learned a lot and are going to create some awesome plugins and help other people with their workflows. And if you have some questions about my personal plugins or my work in general, you can go to henke.design and contact me there. Or if you're still learning and need some help with your own plugins, I can recommend the developer forums where you can ask a question, and there are many talented people who can help you there. All right, see you, bye.